So today is very fitting to conclude this year's seminar series with our very own Professor Imre Galambos. Professor Imre Galambos received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in Chinese studies, and then worked at the British Library's International Dunhuang project for 10 years. 10 years ago, this year, he started at Cambridge and is now a professor in Chinese, specializing in Dunhuang codicology. Today, he's going to be presenting about antecedents for horizontal writing of the Chinese script and presenting the complexities of this phenomenon. So let's please welcome Professor Imre Galambos.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. And I'm going to share my screen. So welcome, everyone. Very glad that I have this opportunity to speak in front of an audience about this project, because I've been working on it for quite a while and I'm trying to write it up as we speak. And I really would appreciate some feedback or some thoughts. Maybe I've missed certain aspects of this phenomenon, or maybe other people have some ideas. The topic is basically about writing Chinese horizontally. And I will look at this in a chronological spectrum. So as we know, in most cases in pre-modern China, Chinese texts were written in vertical columns going from right to left. And here you see an example. This is a stele. It's a rubbing of a stele of the calligraphy of the famous calligrapher Yan Zhenxing. And as you can see, the columns go vertically from right to left. So the same goes for any book basically published in pre-modern China. So here, for example, we have a text by the military strategist Zhuge Liang in a collection by a Tao Zongyi called Shuofu. So this beautiful print is at the guest library at Princeton University. And as you can see that the lines go, or if you don't read Chinese, it's still, you can trust me that the lines go vertically from right to left. So you begin with this line and then you go to the next and then the next and so forth. So this is very standard and we're used to this, to see this kind of writing in Chinese. And so when we see something different, we get a little bit surprised, of course. But the same thing doesn't apply to modern China, where you have all sorts of writings. This is a 1949 copy of the Renmin Zhibao, the People's Daily. And you can see this was a pivotal moment in Chinese history, of course. But what you can see is if we zoom in a little bit here, we can see that the text, these texts that are marked with blue, they go horizontally from left to right. And this text that I marked in red goes vertically from right to left in columns from right to left. And then elsewhere we have text underneath the image of Mao Zedong. We have a caption that goes from right to left horizontally. So basically in this one page of a newspaper, we can see three orientations of or three directions of the script, which I think is pretty amazing. I don't think other languages can handle this kind of orientation. And this is not unusual in 20th century China, and even today, especially in advertisements and also in newspapers or magazines. It's very common to see Chinese text oriented in at least 2 or 3 different ways. So looking at the source of this, there hasn't been a lot of research made on this phenomenon, which is quite interesting because, or quite surprising, because people have studied, for example, the history of Chinese punctuation or the history of the Chinese switch to vernacular Chinese in writing. These movements are always associated with this in the early part of the 20th century with the movement to modernize China, to make China catch up with the rest of the world. And so it's quite interesting or unexpected that this very visual aspect and very conspicuous aspect of Chinese writing hasn't been explored in much detail before. One of the studies that focus on this is this article by Zhang Zhiqiang. And as you can see, it's only 3 pages long. So it's a very short analysis of it. And then we also have Tom Mulaney's article that came out recently. And there he looks at this whole phenomenon. He calls it the horizontalization of Chinese, together with the new style punctuation. And it's very interesting. He looks at this phenomenon or these phenomena in light of this Chinese desire to modernize. So writing from left to right, the way English is written or French is written, was equated with modernity, with being modern. And so the Chinese were trying to be modern, and therefore there was this drive to turn the direction of Chinese writing into this horizontal arrangement or orientation. But my focus is actually not on modern China, not on how this was part of the modernization of China, because in the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century, or by the second half of 20th century, horizontal writing from left to right, so basically a la English, became very, very common, and maybe the most common way of writing. So if you see students writing in notebooks, even today, they would write usually in that direction from left to right. And so my focus is more not on this modernization drive, but more on where does it come from? Or what are the precedents? What are the influences that make it possible for the Chinese script to be written in this manner? And so often people say that the first text that was, or the first book that was published in this manner is this book by Lu Zhuangzhang, Yi Mu Liao Ran Chu Jie. So this was published in 1892, and the title means something like the beginning of looking at it with a fresh eye, or something like that. And this person, Lu Zhuangzhang, was actually quite instrumental in developing Chinese pinyin, or the romanization of Chinese. He was one of the first people who was interested in romanization. And of course, he has a missionary background. He was associated with missionary schools, and part of his inspiration probably came from how missionaries were translating Christian scriptures and then publishing them in Romanized editions. So here we can see an inside of this book, and we can see that the Chinese, which is actually vernacular Chinese, is written from left to right. So here you can see that you have, for example, 有一只狗, so there's a dog, or 咬一块肉, to have a bite of meat, and so forth. This is a book which is printed, but it contains Chinese phrases written from left to right. So this is not just 1 or 2 words, but actually something beyond that, something chunks of language that are larger than 1 or 2 words. And so we can consider this as one of the first examples of printing Chinese with this orientation of going horizontally from left to right. And then another often cited example is this book, Algebra Made Easy, which was published by Edwin Houston and Arthur Canale. This is a 1900 edition, but actually was published a year or 2 years earlier. The first edition is from 1898. And it was translated into Chinese the following year with the title 算式解法, which basically means algebra. And on the inside, unfortunately, I don't have images of the whole book, so I only have a couple of examples, and I put one here where you see the orientation kind of changes following the mathematical functions or equations. It's not a very good example, but I don't have a better example available to me at the moment. And then if we go further in time, we see this in 1904 we have a book by Yan Fu, which is called English Grammar Explained in Chinese. So, 英文汉语. This is a book where, again, because of the English, you have the Chinese oriented from left to right. Not everywhere. So there are big parts of the book that are written from right to left, vertically, following the traditional orientation of the script. But there are examples, extensive examples of text written in this English manner or Western manner, as you can see here. So these are the early examples from the beginning of the 20th century. And so by the 1910s and especially the 1920s, this phenomenon becomes much more widespread, and it starts to be used in schools, and magazines begin to be published in this way. And I think it's really part of this whole drive to modernize Chinese writing, in a sense that this goes hand in hand with the adoption of new punctuation, for example, which is also very, very important if you look at how Chinese is written. And all these changes, they have become a stable part of Chinese writing and are used even today. So although these reforms were done exactly 100 years ago, or even a little more than 100 years ago, they have become part of the written language in China. Actually, if we look back a little bit further, we look for precedents. Some Chinese scholars have pointed out the importance of this dictionary by Robert Morrison, who was an Anglo-Scottish missionary. And his dictionary, which was published over the course of several years, it's called A Dictionary of the Chinese Language in 3 parts. It's published in Macau by the East India Company's Press. And it's a large dictionary of the Chinese language, extremely well done and well received. It was reprinted several times, and it was basically a much needed tool at the time when such tools were not readily available for the English language. And in this dictionary, if we look on the inside, we can see that we have Chinese phrases, or sometimes I wouldn't call them sentences, of course. Well, let's say Chinese phrases are arranged in this English way. They're inserted into the English text, and then they are translated, transliterated, and also translated. So here, for example, you have, I don't know, 反上为下. So here, the translation is the opposite of above. So 下, denoting below, the opposite of above. This kind of arrangement is very obvious in a dictionary, and it wasn't entirely intuitive at the time, because Morrison felt the need to explain this. And this is what he wrote at the end of his preface. He says, "It is well known that the Chinese read from the top of the page to the bottom, and from the right-hand column to the left. Horizontal lines also occur, and in that case, they read from right to left. In alphabetic languages, as the termination of one letter generally joins onto the other that follows it, the order cannot be altered without throwing the whole into confusion. To read Hebrew or Arabic or Persian from right to left," and here I think he made a mistake because he wanted to say from left to right, "would be impracticable. In Chinese, however, each character is so completely distinct that it matters not how they are placed in relation to each other. They would read as well from the bottom of the page to the top as from top to bottom. In works, Tartar and Chinese, they begin at the left side of the book. In this dictionary, it has been judged proper to read the Chinese characters horizontally and from left to right." This is an explanation, basically, spelled out why he's doing this. And there are 2 important things that we can see here. One of his justifications is that each character is completely distinct. So the Chinese characters are not joined together as they are sometimes in Western languages. So they are not joined into words, and the words are not joined into, well, we don't join the words. So they are not joined into words, basically, the letters. And because of that, you can actually read them from any direction to any direction. Even you could read them from the bottom to the top if you chose to do so. So this is an idea which is quite common in Chinese, seeing Chinese characters as this 方块字, so square units of characters. So because of that, they're not linked in any way, usually, unless, of course, something is written in a very cursive way, but usually they're not linked to each other, and it's possible to arrange them the way you prefer to arrange them. Now, the second idea here that's actually quite interesting is that he says, basically in texts that are written in Tartar and Chinese, so in Manchu and Chinese, they begin at the left side of the book. And here he's referring to these bilingual Manchu and Chinese editions where the Chinese text basically follows the Manchu. So the Manchu is written from left to right, but in vertical columns. And then the Chinese is placed on the side by the Manchu text. And so even though it's vertical, it goes from left to right. So when Morrison makes this claim, or he alludes to this, he's saying that there's a precedent for this. There's a precedent for what I'm doing, because Chinese is already written from left to right in these Manchu works. So this is during the Qing dynasty, obviously. So this would be mostly the 18th century and then the 19th century. Initially, when I looked at this, at Chinese scholars writing about Morrison's dictionary, I didn't quite understand why they would pick a Protestant dictionary maker as sort of the point of origin. And I thought English was certainly not the first language in which missionaries dealt with Chinese, and I wanted to look around. So before turning to the Jesuits, I looked, for example, in Russian, and you have this famous book by Nikita Bichurin. He was a monk, also known as Hyacinth. That was his monastic name. And he has a book called Грамматика китайского языка, so the grammar of the Chinese language. He uses the Chinese title, Han Wen Qi Meng, and he borrows this from the French sinologist Abel Rémusat, who uses the same Chinese title. But of course, the book is not entirely the same. It's a little bit different. And it's interesting that in this book, Bichurin, when he quotes Chinese text, he actually makes the Chinese text follow the flow of the Russian and the direction of the Russian. And I think he does this because he adds transliteration. So he transcribes the Chinese characters, and in order to enable his readers read the text properly, I think he needs to arrange the Chinese characters from left to right in a horizontal direction. So this way, if somebody reads the transliteration, then he can read the text correctly. And as you can see, this entire text is written horizontally from left to right. There are two full sentences here, and they're transliterated and also translated. This book was published in 1838. So this was a little bit later than Morrison's dictionary, but Bichurin may not have seen Morrison's dictionary. Maybe he has, but it's possible that he has not. But also, judging by the title of his work, he was probably more oriented towards French scholarship. And at that time, French scholarship was, of course, much more accessible and much more popular than English language scholarship. So if we look at French precedents, interestingly, the sinologist I just mentioned, Abel Rémusat, who wrote a book by the same title as Bichurin, he does not arrange his characters in that direction. He always arranges the Chinese characters in the orthodox direction, going from right to left, and usually vertically. So Bichurin could not have learned this way of writing from him. But if we go further back in time, we can see, for example, this book published by De Guin, and it was published in 1808. I put the Arabic numbers in case somebody has problems with Roman numerals. This book was published before Morrison's dictionary. And as we can see, he has this table of the emperors of China, starting from 2953 BC and going up until 1736, so not too long before his time, a few decades before his time. So interestingly, you have the name of the mythical emperors and the other emperors here written from left to right. So here, for example, we have Fuxi, and you see that the transliteration also goes that way. And obviously, the whole reason for writing the Chinese characters in this manner is that they would follow the transliteration. So because the readers would engage with the transliteration primarily, that's sort of the main text, even though it's smaller than the Chinese characters. So here we have the three mythical emperors, Fuxi, Shenlong, and Huangdi. And just to show you that this was not a straightforward issue, this was not uncontroversial, there was a book review, or just a critique of De Guin's book. And in this critique, a sinologist with a pseudonym who called himself Sinologus Berlinensis, so a sinologist from Berlin, who was actually Antonio Montucci. So he said, De Guin violated the constant and fixed principles of all Oriental languages by placing his characters from left to right. So he criticizes him for arranging Chinese characters in this manner because he thinks, or Montucci, he thinks that this is not something permissible. So this is not something you would do. And because of this, Montucci also thought that De Guin was probably not capable of compiling a Chinese-French dictionary. He was entrusted to do by Napoleon. So this was a big deal, obviously, for De Guin. And so he responded immediately, or very soon, and he said, "As for this writer's claim that I violated the rules of Oriental languages by presenting my characters from left to right instead of right to left, I followed in this the example of the Chinese, who, as I saw it during my journey, sometimes write this way. Indeed, I have before me a Chinese phrase book sent to me by missionaries from Peking, whose characters, more than 5,000 in number, are written from left to right. Moreover, this was the only way that I could ensure that my readers would not go wrong when reading." So again, this is a very, very interesting text because it spells out why somebody would choose to write in this way, going from left to right, to arrange Chinese characters from left to right. So here, De Guin claims that he has seen Chinese people doing this, but then he says that he has a Chinese phrase book sent to him by missionaries. So it's actually not very clear whether the phrase book was written by Chinese people or, which is more likely, the missionaries. Probably we can say that there are two claims here. One is that he had seen Chinese people doing this, and then he had seen, or he has evidence of Western missionaries doing this. And then finally, there's another claim which is quite interesting. He says that he's done this because this was the only way that people would not kind of get confused over which syllable belongs to which character in the transliteration. So this is also a practical solution. So this is from 1808 and 1809, this debate. De Guin responds to this because this commission of compiling the dictionary from the emperor obviously is extremely important. So he cannot leave this unanswered. It becomes a matter of sort of keeping the commission. And so that's why he responds to Montucci's criticism. But I wanted to go back a few decades further in time and still staying with the French missionaries, the Jesuit missionaries. We have this book written by, well, it's a letter from Peking on the genius of the Chinese language. and it's written by Sibo, who is identified here as a father of the Jesuit order, and he's a missionary in Peking. This book was published in 1776, and the letter dates almost 10 years earlier, I think 9 years earlier. You can see here on the right side, we have a whole sentence again, and we can see that it actually goes from left to right. So, 书不尽言，言不尽意. And then it's translated here into Latin. So the books do not exhaust the words, and the words do not exhaust the ideas. And there's no question in the direction in which it is written. And this line actually, together with both the Chinese characters and the transcription, is then reprinted in a number of French publications dealing with China in the following 10 to 20 years. You can see the same line quite often in other books from this period or shortly afterwards. And so if we make further steps back, we can actually arrive at the Portuguese-Chinese dictionary of Ricci and Ruggieri, which was compiled in Guangdong at the end of the 16th century. So obviously, we've now skipped the 17th century, but there are further examples of publications where Chinese is written in this horizontal manner by Jesuit missionaries. And I didn't want to list everyone because it gets monotonous. And so we make this larger jump to a dictionary that was not published. It's a large dictionary, and it was lost for some time, but it was discovered recently and then published by John Wittek in 2001 as a facsimile edition. And so you can see here that you have the Portuguese words, and then you have the Chinese words on the right side. In the middle, there's the transliteration, and the right-hand side is written from left to right. So you can see phrases like 要相杀, so about to kill someone, or 惊怕, to be alarmed, or something like that. So this is very obvious that the entire dictionary is written in this way, and there are hundreds of pages. So this dictionary would have been quite influential at the time, and even though it was not published in printing, it would have had some impact. So when de Guin was writing about a dictionary sent to him by missionaries from Peking, he was probably talking about not this dictionary per se, but about a dictionary that was similar to this, maybe also in scope. And so as you can see, we're already at the 16th century, which is we're getting to the time when foreigners begin to be involved in trade with China, in missionary activities, and also in scholarship. But it's also important to see that this is not entirely a Chinese versus foreigners enterprise to occasionally switch the direction of Chinese writing, because we have actual precedents for this within China. So because this is the Manchu period, the Qing dynasty, there are quite a number of these printed texts, and sometimes handwritten ones, Buddhist texts, sometimes dharanis, sometimes scriptures, which are written in several different languages. And so, for example, here, this text is the sutra in 42 sections, and it's written in 4 languages. So you have Tibetan, Mongolian, Manchu, and then Chinese. And as you can see, the Chinese is written from left to right. And this is particularly interesting because the Manchu and the Mongolian are written vertically. So the Chinese does not necessarily have to follow this horizontal direction, but somehow it does. And in doing that, it's following the Tibetan text on the top. So basically these horizontal lines of the Tibetan and Chinese, they frame the other 2 languages. And you can see that this text is very clearly goes from left to right. So like the word biqiu for monk, biqiu suo shuo, is written from left to right. And so with this, we are towards the end of the 18th century. This is a print that is today at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And from 1780, we can go back a little bit and see, for example, this manuscript. So this is handwritten. These are praises of the Buddha's mother or hymns. And the calligraphy was done by the sixth son of the Qianlong emperor, who was also the general editor of the Siku Quanshu. So it's obvious that Qianlong was very fond of these kinds of arrangements, this kind of layout for scriptures or for other Buddhist texts. And here we have an example of his son copying it. So this is at the National Library of China. And here we have something from the 12th year of the Qianlong's reign, of the Qianlong emperor's reign. So that's from 1747. So these are the 300 images of the Buddha. And we have only 2 languages. And that's very important because it seems that Tibetan is usually the number 1 language. So for the other ones, for the previous examples, that was also the case. Tibetan was the most important one, and it was written on the top. The other languages were translations of the Tibetan, almost like commenting or glossing the Tibetan. So in this case, also the actual captions are in Tibetan. And of course, Tibetan reads horizontally from left to right. And so here we have 3 captions, and the Chinese goes also from left to right. So this is the Arbi Mila, so the 2-handed Maitreya, and so forth. So this is the middle of the 18th century, and this print is at the National Library of China. So here's another example, a few years earlier. So we're gradually moving back in time, and we can see that this is not uncommon at all. The Chinese text goes from left to right, again, following the Tibetan on the top, and despite the vertical arrangement of the Manchu. And then further stepping back in time, because initially, actually, I thought that these texts were related to Qianlong, or Qianlong was very fond of them. But here we are at the beginning of the Yongzheng era, so before Qianlong in 1723, and we have a similar example. Basically, this is the Heart Sutra, the Mohe Poro Polomito Xinjing, and the Chinese follows the direction of the Tibetan, and they kind of sandwich the other languages together from 2 sides. So there's also this aesthetic or layout quality to writing Chinese in that manner. And then the earliest printed text I was able to find where Chinese goes that way is this fragment from Berlin. And Sam van Schaik, in a study that's largely talking about this print, dates it to the 13th or 14th century. So you can see that the Chinese is the transcription of the famous Tibetan prayer or mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. So here we have the Ni Padme Hum. And it's very clear that it goes from left to right. And it's a printed text. But we can make another step further backwards, and we arrive at the Dunhuang manuscripts to the 10th century. This is a manuscript I discussed in my book, and basically it's written on poti leaves, which we've seen. The previous examples were all on that form, that book form, which is essentially in China, it's a Tibetan book form. So here the Chinese text is also written in this quintessentially Tibetan book, or leaves, Tibetan folios, and it goes horizontally from left to right. So there are not many examples of this. I've seen 2 different manuscripts, and there are many folia to each of them, but there are 2 examples. So it's not 1 example, but 2. And I think it's significant that Chinese was sometimes written this way. And it's very clear where this influence or where this motivation comes from, because it comes from Tibetan scribal culture, and it basically emulates the way Tibetan is written. And we have further examples from Dunhuang, for example, also on similar kinds of poti leaves. Sometimes the pagination goes in horizontal lines from left to right. So in this case, we have the number 76, 76, written basically from left to right, the same way it would be written today. And then this is my last example, I think. I wanted to show this famous glossary of Buddhist terminology. It's in Tibetan and Chinese, and it's clear that the Tibetan is the main language, and the Chinese characters are glossing the Tibetan text. So they're glossing the Tibetan word. And as you can see, some of the Chinese characters are written in vertical columns, usually with 2 characters per column, but sometimes they're written horizontally. So here we have Xumi Shan, so the name of Mount Sumeru, the sacred Buddhist mountain, or here the word Da Gong Dian, so a great palace, and so forth. So here like Pusa, Bodhisattva, or Fan Nao, vexation. So these are words that are common words in Buddhist texts. And here, the reason why the Chinese characters are written in this manner is because they are auxiliary to the Tibetan text. So the only reason why they would change the direction of writing is because it's not just that they're emulating the Tibetan text, but they are kind of helping. They're there to aid the Tibetan text. And because of that, it becomes important to write them in that direction. And so with that, we come back a full circle, because I wanted to step through this basically 1,000 years and to show the precedents, that we have precedents in each period. And I don't necessarily want to talk about influences here. I'm not saying that the Dunhuang manuscripts influenced the Ming or the Yuan dynasty print, which influenced the Ming dynasty prints, and then the Qing dynasty prints. And because of them, in the 20th century or late 19th century, Chinese intellectuals decided to change the direction of writing. Instead, I just wanted to show that this was a kind of a complex situation that was not unprecedented. And actually, something that I haven't really talked about today is that this phenomenon was happening not only in China, it was also happening in Japan. And interestingly, in the modern period, in Japan, it happened faster. So Japanese written texts going from left to right horizontally, they predate the Chinese ones by several decades. It would be also really important to look at the Japanese examples, but not only the Japanese examples, because we should probably also look at the Manchu, the way Manchu was written a little bit more carefully. And I'm primarily thinking about how Manchu was handled by Western missionaries. So Western missionaries quite early on turned Manchu writing sideways in order to be able to insert it into running French or English text. And they also talked about this. They discussed this, why they were able to do so, or why they decided to do so. So one of the arguments here was that because the Manchu script is basically the same script as you have in Syriac, the Manchu script was adopted from the Mongols, which was adopted from the Uyghurs, and so forth. And it goes back to the Syriac script. So you can actually read it without any harm sideways, the way you would read Syriac text. So this attitude of Western missionaries towards Manchu is very, very interesting and very important also for how they were handling Chinese text. And so there was this readiness, if not willingness, to insert Chinese characters following the orientation of English or French or Latin. And finally, another thing that I wanted to mention is that this direction of writing in China today, for example, is also partly dependent on where you see the text. For example, if you look at vehicles, so you look at buses or taxis, then the text always runs from the front of the bus to the end of the bus. On the other side, it runs the other way around, which also means that it runs from the front to the back. So on the same vehicle, you have text written in 2 directions by default. And this is not always the case, but I think it's quite often the case. And this also shows that there's some form of flexibility in how Chinese text can be read or Chinese text can be written. And so a lot depends on the context. One thing that we haven't seen is Chinese text going from the bottom up. And I think actually there are examples of that in Dunhuang, where the text goes kind of down and up and down and up. But I'm not talking about those here today. And finally, the last thing that I wanted to mention is that this way of writing, for example, from left to right, occasionally not horizontally, but also vertically, is also something we see sometimes on Zen paintings or Zen poetry, on Zen calligraphy. So seeing a text written in kind of the opposite direction to how we're accustomed to reading them can sometimes throw off the translator. And Tim Barrett has a very interesting, funny article about this, about a specific case of mistranslating a Zen poem like that. And I would recommend everyone to read that. Okay, I think this is how much I wanted to talk today. So thank you for listening.